Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to the seventh and penultimate session of our Fractures Internationalist teachings, brought to you by the Transnational Institute in partnership with our co-organizing organizations, NOR, the Asia-Europe People's Forum, the Global Network of Movement Lawyers, and the Alternative Information and Development Center. A big thank you to our co-organizers who've played a big role in getting all the amazing speakers that we have brought through these sessions and in co-organizing and putting together all the different sessions that we've had. So far, we've had 6 amazing conversations where we've tackled questions like what will the new world order look like, and looking at the changes in the post-World War II international order, wondering if we've got the end of neoliberalism, why is the far right on the rise, are we headed for World War III? And indeed, how do we protect our planet in the course of all these fractures that we're seeing? The series looks at fractures that we're seeing in the global setup and opportunities that may arise for movements. And today we want to look at something that takes the issue a bit more closer to who we are as activists and as people who are involved in the global struggle for a more just, equitable, and prosperous world. How do we win? How do we bring together all our different movements to bring a turnaround in the global setup? We've got amazing speakers today. And first of all, a big thank you to also the co-organizers in the background, Nick Buxton, Jess Graham, the entire TNI team that is coming together to make this, to bring you this session. I'd like to introduce our amazing speakers for today in this session. And our first speaker will be Tooba Syed, who is a writer and organizer with the left and feminist movement in Pakistan. She has spearheaded the Auraf Azadi March, Women's Emancipation March movement in Pakistan, and has been an active part of the land and housing rights movement. She's a visiting faculty of gender studies. She's visiting the Faculty of Gender Studies and works as a feminist trainer in South Asia. She's currently associated with Women Democratic Front, a socialist feminist organization that she co-founded along with her comrades, and is also a part of a leftist political party in Pakistan. She's also currently documenting the rise of the anti-gender movement in Pakistan. Thank you so much, Tooba, for joining us. And second, we've got Dr. Nimmi Gowrinathan, who is an activist, writer, scholar, and founder of the Politics of Sexual Violence Initiative, where she directs Beyond Identity, a gendered platform for scholar activists at We Are Purposeful, the publisher of the literary journal Adi Magazine, and the creator of the Female Fighter series at Guernica Magazine. Described by Valeria Luiselli as proof of a political imagination like no other, her book, Radicalizing Her, published in 2021, examines the complex politics of the female fighter. Her forthcoming book, Occupation and the Body, maps state violence onto the gendered body, upcoming from Yale in 2026. Our third speaker is Shanelle Matthews, who collaborates with social justice activist organizations and campaigns to inspire action and build narrative power for justice and liberation. She's the former Movement for Black Lives Communications Director and a distinguished lecturer at City College of New York. Shanelle founded Radical Communicators Network, RADCOMS, a global community of practice movement communications workers, and is the co-editor of Liberation Stories, Building Narrative Power for 21st Century Social Movements, an anthology detailing world-building narrative campaigns and strategies led by social movement communications workers in the 21st century. Thank you so much to all our speakers for joining us today. I'd like to ask all the speakers to please speak slowly, make sure that you articulate well so that the audience can follow. And for the audience, in case you're having trouble following some of those speakers, please, there's a button at the bottom of your Zoom interface that says show captions. So if you show the captions, you can follow along well and read the live captioning of what we're hearing. But before we get to our speakers, let's find out a little bit from you in the audience. Can you tell us what social movements, campaigns, or political organization you're most involved in right now? Just share a quick input in the chat. Tell us where you're coming from. What are some of the engagements that you're involved in? We're trying to learn from each other. This is a particularly salient moment for movements. We feel the ground is shaky, things are moving. This is time for movements to align, to bring links together, and to learn from each other, because only together can we overcome. So please share in the chat what you're up to, where you're organizing, what kind of movements you're involved in, and we will try to kind of collect all the best ideas, of course, and share amongst all the different movements, people that are here today and people that will get to interact with this webinar afterwards. So thank you so much. Tell us where you are in the chat, and tell us what you're up to. And now we're going to go to our speakers. I think we'll start with you, Tooba. So you've been involved in landless peasant housing rights and feminist movements in Pakistan, and also involved in many strategies around the women's liberation mobilizations led by socialist feminist groups in Pakistan to party political organizing, right? So tell us more about these different tactics for resistance. How do you choose them? What impact have they had? And what lessons have you learned in your current work?
Thank you so much. I hope I'm audible. Just a disclaimer, I do talk very fast, so I'm going to try and pace myself like I'm doing right now, but do let me know in the chat if I'm going fast. It is a big question, so I'm going to try and focus on the lesson learned. As you shared, a part of both very hierarchical, structured organization as well as non-hierarchical movement-based organizing. I've been organizing in Pakistan for more than a decade, and that's primarily where I work. So my opinions, my insights are coming from where I organize, and it might not resonate that well with others. And I kind of like talk about this fully well knowing that. One thing, I think one of the most important lessons for me as an organizer in the last few years has been to kind of make this distinction between activism and organizing. And this was not something which I was very focused on a few years ago, but in the last few years, I've noticed, I mean, especially with the rise of social media and, so much of our organizing work, our information dissemination work, has moved to online sort of platforms, and we heavily rely on them. I think it's true absolutely for most places. And that's the same kind of case in Pakistan, that a lot of the organizing really depends on these big tech platforms, especially Twitter, which was actually banned until a few weeks ago in Pakistan. So I think what happened with that we saw this rise in celebrity activism, or you can say like these sole activist voices online, which in some ways, yes, brought a lot of attention to our movements, but at the same time, it did take away from grassroots organizing as well. So what we saw in our experience was a lot of, and it was not just about individual behaviors, that they started translating into how movements also started behaving. So for example, I do this distinction I make is I see activism as something which is much more issue-based. It is much more about, talking about a specific issue in a particular moment. It does follow the news cycle. It's also more about what's up and coming as compared to looking at the structural sort of problems and issues that those issues have been arising from. And I see organizing as something which is much more boring, repetitive. It has to be done within the communities. It has to be done offline. It's not always going to give you an adrenaline rush. It is not always going to get you excited. It's boring ones, boring meetings. You sit through meetings and have discussions and hold each other accountable, and there are hierarchical sort of functional hierarchies that you have to move through and work through. And it's also a lot of the work is based on consensus building, rather than canceling or calling out people. And I think this has become a very big problem in progressive movements in Pakistan, at least, where activism has taken over so much space in our movements that there's very little space for disagreement, but also for making mistakes. And as a result of that, what has happened in many of our movements is that people are less interested in the long term. They're less interested in doing the tedious work because it's easier to raise your voice when you're a sole sort of voice in this. There's also this decline in interest in organizational building, or let's say party building on the left. Activists like me who associate, or feminist organizers like myself who associate with a political party are actually seen as suspicious. And the primary reason for that is I work alongside men, and I'm not just working with women. I work with working class men. I work with also non-working class men in some cases, because there are middle class people also in our organizations and movements. And that already brings me into a lot of suspicion, and women like me or activists like myself. And I think it's one problem that I see is that there's very unconscious project of this minoritizing of the majority, where you have to constantly prove how exceptional your voice is, how unique your struggles are, how essential your nuances are. And I see this continuously, this is happening, that we're reinventing the wheel instead of naming that what we're going through or what we're dealing with is an imperialist, colonizing, racialized, and now militarized capitalism. I see that, we invent new names for these kind of oppressions and the oppressors, instead of really focusing on what is common between the people of the world, and not just one country. So I think this, for me, it's very important to also see that whether consciously and unconsciously, our movements are falling in the trap of neoliberalism. And I do feel like it comes in good faith when people are doing it, when we're bringing these nuances to the movements. But what ends up happening, and this turns out into a cancel culture, call out culture, more than calling in culture. And I think that's what we need more of. There's very little talk about healing, for example, within our movements. We talk very, very often, we talk about, okay, what about reformation and restoration justice within our movements? And I think that's a very important cause for me, because it's leading to a lot of how do you say it, like scattering of movements. So I do feel in the recent history, I've also seen in my own sort of organizing experience, where I've been involved with the feminist movement, and I have taken a break from the visible feminist movement. And just to give you a context, so basically, Pakistan has had after a very long break, a very vibrant political, public feminist movement, which has come into rise in the last 5 years. And it's been very organic. So women's marches have started happening. They have seen wonderful mobilizations. But what ended up happening, because there was a lack of sort of coordination, there was lack of organizing. A lot of it was based around one day, which is the 8th March, the International Working Women's Day. So what ended up happening within that movement, that a lot of us were unable to talk to each other, because we were all independent. We were not accountable to each other or any one structure, right? So as a result of that, what's happened is that we've been unable to evolve our strategies. The only strategy that the movement has over the years is showing up. Is basically showing up to this particular place on this particular day to express sort of your politics. And I think what it does, it really limited our organizing capacities, where, in my opinion, what should have been done is the people who should have been on our side, which is the masses, the majority of the people, are actually anti-Aurat March right now. It also gave rise to an anti-rights and anti-gender movement in the country. And I think a lot of this has to do with the absence of that long-term organizing and long-term sort of commitment to the cause, where you're showing up every day instead of once a day every year. So yes, I'm going to stop over here. And if anyone has questions, I can further get into this later. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tooba. Thank you for that very sober analysis and for sort of ringing the warning bell, so to speak, to movements. Like, we need a bigger umbrella now more than ever, and we need to be calling in, you say, rather than calling out, and indeed doing the more tedious long-term work that then makes us more powerful when there are activist issues or specific moments that need mobilization. So thank you so much for pointing that out. And I'd like to follow on to this to ask Nimmi, who's worked on something a sort of different angle on this. Nimmi, you've written extensively about resistance, including armed struggle, right, and the stories of women combatants. So why do women and gender expansive people and others choose armed struggle? I think it's an important question to get to now.
Thank you for having me. You can hear me?
Yes.
Um, I think we are at a moment. My work, I think the flyer was wrong. I'm not with the Climate Action Network. I'm with the Politics of Sexual Violence Initiative that I founded. My work for 20 years has been with female fighters in the Tamil liberation struggle in Sri Lanka, the Tamil Tigers. I've also worked with women in the FARC, women in Eritrea. And I'm here right now at a gathering where we are meeting with women from the IRA and women from the MK in South Africa. My entry point into this work is through the female fighter, which means that I understood most of it very differently in terms of the space that women can occupy. The reasons they joined, I think obviously there are multiple reasons why women join liberation struggles, right? But I think that we're at a moment now because of what's happening in Gaza that we can have a different conversation about violence, right? And so the first thing I want to say is that people expect one to enter into a binary. They'll always try and force me into a binary of condemning or condoning violence. Condemning or condoning violence matters very little when violence is simply a political reality for all of the people that are in these contexts, right? In my research, what I found is that, of course, women join, some of them, because of poverty, some of them because of an ideological connection to the struggle, some of them because they had no choice. But in spending time with the fighters, what the through line that I found was that it was state violence is the reason that women joined, right? And so when you think about, I think about the position of a lot of women, and particularly, Tamil women, as like concentric circles, that you have the woman in the middle, you have the marriage, you have the family, the culture, the community, the state, all of which are forms of constraining her, right? Forms of oppression in different ways. And I think sometimes what we're taught through Western feminism is, if she breaks free of an abusive marriage or sex trafficking, or then she has power, right? But power exists all the way on the outside. So whether you agree or disagree with the choice to engage in violence, for me, what the fighter did was break through all of these at once. She had to go against her family. She had to go against the role that women had to play in society. But what she did was hold the state accountable, which very few women get to do. And I think, the reason that I kind of move from the space of the female fighter is I think that she complicates things for us that we need to complicate. I think particularly in the West, in conversations on gender, you have these kind of two circles. One is, nonviolence is the only form of resistance that's acceptable, even though the state, of course, is implicit in all the violence against our bodies. And on the other hand, that women are more peaceful than men. And that in between those two, like that Venn diagram, is where the female fighter gets, erased. No, we're not able to see her because of those two things. So the female fighter, for me, offers a kind of reflection on gender and politics, and an insistence that we see the complex politics of women, not just, the ones who are democratic and peaceful, but the ones who are nationalists, the ones who are separatists, the ones who are Marxists, communists, the ones who are all the ideologies we don't agree with. right? Who are not peacefully engaging, who made these decisions. And what I've seen here in this conversation is that there's an immediate, deep recognition of each other, the women in the IRA, the women in the Tigers, the women in the MK, that they see each other so clearly. And we are also meeting with the Palestinian movement here. And that we're for the first time able to have an honest conversation about violence. We don't have to start by saying, like, we don't support violence and we don't, but an honest conversation about violence and its impact on women's lives.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nimmi, and thank you for giving us an insight into what must be extremely deep and I think reflective conversations, as you say, about indeed the role of violence and the resistance to violence. You say it, as you say, particularly state violence, and really for telling us this beautiful story of these women who complicate the idea of what is a woman. In South Africa, they say umfazi yimbokodo, right? The struggle is based on the powerful woman, and that is true most parts of the world as well. Let's bring Shanelle into the conversation. Shanelle, so there's a sense amongst that progressive and left forces have fallen behind the right in shaping the narrative and winning popular support. Like we heard in the third session where we had Anita Gurumurti, who spoke about how tech oligarchs have created platforms that amplify misogyny, sexism, racism, and other forms of discrimination as integral features into their platforms and not bugs. So, is there anything we could have done differently, like as progressive forces, to overcome or bypass the capitalist and eugenicist imperialist logics that dominate big tech and much of the traditional media as well?
Yeah, thank you, Sean. And thank you for the invitation to be here today. I'm really honored to be a part of this conversation um, and really aligned with what Tooba and Nimmi have offered already. It's really powerful. As you mentioned earlier, I am a movement worker and I focus on building narrative power. And I just want to do a little level setting so that we're all aligned on what narrative power actually is. It refers to the ability to tell stories in a society, to determine who tells those stories and how they're interpreted. And it's really about shaping belief systems and worldviews through storytelling. And so to answer your question, could we have done things differently? I mean, yes, the right didn't just out-organize us, they outmaneuvered us. They out-strategized us narratively, and they understand that culture and algorithms and ideology are all mutually reinforcing. And they moved really early to colonize the architecture of our digital lives and made fear and nostalgia and supremacy feel like common sense. And this is the challenge, the rhetorical and communications and narrative assignment that the left has to contend with in this particular moment. Because right now we are living in the narrative terrain of our oppressors. Um, so yeah, we could have done something differently, but we also have to hold, as you know, my esteemed co-panelists just pointed out, that many of us have been fighting for survival. We've been organizing against austerity and police violence, as we see in Los Angeles right now, displacement and ecological collapse. And we don't have the infrastructure that our opponents have to be able to tell our stories in meaningful ways, but we can exploit the contemporary means of communication. And I think there are a few ways that we can do that. I mean, one thing that is important here, and I'm speaking from a US context because this is where I've done my narrative organizing for the last 15 years, is that we need narrative infrastructure. And that's important because we don't have the same kind of think tanks and media machines and meme farms and bots that the right has. We need durable and well-resourced infrastructure. And right now, I don't know if this is true for other people, but we are in a battle with the philanthropic institutions to invest in narrative infrastructure or even base building infrastructure. It feels like we are in many ways drowning and they are holding the life raft above our head. And it's quite frustrating, but investing in that long-term infrastructure ensures that we are not just dealing with crisis communications, but that we have the digital infrastructure. It should be secure to the extent that we can do that, to be able to reach people across geography and time and issue. And we do need our own platforms. We have come to rely on the platforms of these devastating man babies. I was just listening to this podcast where one of the venture capitalists was basically saying he was going to align with Trump because he was upset about how the left was critiquing his decision making. And so, I mean, at the end of the day, like, we do not own these means of communication, but they're incredibly powerful and we can exploit them. But we also need new digital spaces rooted in care and justice and collective governance. And so that might look like, technology co-ops, decentralized networks, media tools that don't reward outrage and dehumanization. And to connect to Tooba's assessment on activism and organizing, yes, we have to continue to challenge the respectability politics in communication and narrative strategy. Often, progressive and sometimes radical messaging can be defensive and technocratic. Most people in the United States read at a 5th grade level, but we are often, speaking at highfalutin insider language to people. We need to be able to tell stories in ways that people can understand them. And so, and the storytelling part is so important. And one way that, and we'll talk about an anthology that I just edited that'll come out next week that looks at interventions by the social movement left in the 21st century. One way we can tell unapologetic stories about the world we're building, not just the world that we're fighting against, is by using a narrative power framework. And I understand frameworks in the Black feminist tradition as foundational narrative organizing infrastructure that allows us to have a clear idea of from where we're telling the story and to what end. And so I'll just identify a few elements of that framework we include in the book that might be helpful to those of you listening today. So the first element inside of a comprehensive narrative power framework would be a narrative power analysis. This is just like your power analysis, but in the narrative realm. And so you want to understand how stories influence different perceptions and behaviors and social outcomes. That would be a first step. Secondly, and this is what's distinct between, what Tooba was talking about being in activism and organizing, is that organizing is rooted in principles and traditions. So the second is principles. These are guardrails, they're values-based. They help us determine how to communicate about people, places, ideas, and things in humanizing ways. And traditions help to provide a foundation for our activities, which keep us rooted in our historical legacies. And then the last three, and in closing for my first question, our narrative possibilities. Now, this is really important for us to think as, we enter into a multipolar world where we have rising authoritarianism and rising fascism and gendered violence, that what is possible feels like it's becoming more narrow. So we have to understand what is the potential within the political system to influence those different beliefs. But then we also have to be prepared to take advantage of those possibilities by understanding where there are opportunities for us. So COVID-19 was an opportunity, and the 2008 recession here in the US was an opportunity. And so these are specific situations that allow you to effectively influence policy and change the social and political terrain. And then finally, and most importantly, and we're seeing this globally right now, are what kind of narrative interventions do we want to assert in order to build a more just society? So these are our strategic actions that help us to reshape or introduce new narratives, including reframing narratives or introducing new ones. And so I'll stop here. What I'll say is that it's important to remember that politics is cyclical, right? Progressive and regressive politics are patterned over history. And so we can look at how we could have done things better. But we've also done so much significant work. In this particular moment is a reaction, and we are in a reactionary political moment to what we did in the 2010s. And I would love to share more about that soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shanelle. Wow. It hit me hard there where you said we're struggling in the narrative terrain of our oppressors. It's a difficult question, I think, for most movements, right? How do we organize against the very same people who own the tools with which we organize? And indeed, what you mentioned about having alternatives and building community focused networks and making sure that we don't keep rewarding these networks that reward the greed and power seeking that we're seeing in this sort of what are now traditional platforms that we're operating on. Thank you so much for that reflection, and I'm curious to hear more about the building of narrative power and the second part of what you have to say about that. But and to the audience, please, if you have questions for any of our panelists, please send them in the Q&A, and don't forget to share with us also in the chat what you're actually also involved in right now, how you're resisting and how you're pushing back against the system. Let's come back to you, Tooba. We read somewhere that you attended a feminist training and said you went as a Pakistani, but came back as a South Asian. So how important is transnational organizing in your view and experience? What stories and experiences do you have to share? And how do we best integrate internationalism into our political work, which is a big part of what we're trying to do with this Fracture series?
Thank you for that question. It comes at a very, I don't know, funny sort of situation where within South Asia, Pakistan and India almost went to war. So it does feel a bit strange to talk about transnational solidarity in this moment. But I also feel like it is equally important to talk about that. The course that you're referring to, I went for it in 2016, and because I've been a grassroots organizer for most of my life, we never had enough resources to travel back then because I was a student. And this was the first time that I was meeting my so-called enemies, or the people that my state tells me are the enemies, which are primarily, people from India, people from Bangladesh. And for me as a young girl, I was 24 years of age at that time. And for me, it was an amazing experience to basically know at that age that there are people across the border present in this region who I relate more than perhaps people in my own country. And, it seems like a very naive thing. But to really kind of feel it in the presence of other people in the region, it was life-changing for me. I do think that, the kind of crisis that we're going through right now, I mean, I can talk about Sri Lanka and Pakistan, for example. We are debt-ridden economies. We have been completely ravaged by the imperialist institutions. We continue to be in this situation. We are bankrupt countries right now. Our people are suffering. The IMF keeps imposing one conditionality over another. And I really do feel like, and also with the climate change, I mean, what happens in Delhi also happens in Lahore. So there are few things who we have to deal within our national borders, but many of our issues are something we can only take on if we work on them regionally. And for me, it's also, I also wonder where is the space to really have these transnational or even international sort of conversations. And I'm really glad that I do see in the last year at least that there has been sort of a revival of this conversation around internationalism. For the most part of my activism, it wasn't there. There was this hyper focus on local sort of movements, on national movements, and by national I mean ethno-national movements within our countries as well. So I do think it's very important to connect these movements to understand how so much of what happens, for example, in Balochistan in Pakistan, is not independent of what the US decides, or what the US interventions in Pakistan are like, or in the region like. What are their future plans for this region? And for that very reason, also with the climate change, I mean, Pakistan is one of the countries which is going to be impacted the worst in the world. I think we're at number 8 in terms of how much we're going to be impacted, and we're already seeing this impact not just in Pakistan but across the region, and also all the way to Latin America as well. I mean, it's not just South Asia which is going through that. So I think in the face of all of this, we really do have to see that these issues are not something we can just tackle nationally. So much of what is happening in my country is dependent on who comes into power in your country, and to make these connections, to actually speak to each other, and to actually also invest. And just like, Shanelle was just sharing, and it really resonated with me, that narrative building. Why do we need internationalism? I think that is the very first thing that we have to do, and we have to convince ourselves, because sometimes you're so embedded in your own struggles, in your countries, in your people, that you're unable to see. And I think Palestine is a very good reminder for that what's happening in Palestine is in so many ways a past for so many of us, but also the future for so many of us. And that's exactly why internationalism is important. I mean, we saw what was happening during this brief war we had with India and Pakistan war, and it was kind of, for a moment, so many of us were thinking like, are we going to be are we going to be bombarded just like that? And there's also this trauma associated with what we've been seeing for almost 2 years now with what's happening in Palestine. And I think one of the very important agenda that needs to be, I mean, Palestine is at the heart of third world internationalism. It has to be at the center. And for it to be at the center, I think there's nothing short of an internationalist politics, alliances, powerful institutional building that we need. And I think that it's also time to really reevaluate our own sort of frameworks of how we look at power, how we I mean, I'm no academic. I'm an organizer. So I look at power from that perspective, that I'm no longer interested in speaking truth to power when I know that it's not doing much. I want to seize that power. And I think that's what we need in our movements at home, but also cross-border, internationally. We need to support each other's movements in ways that are not possible, generate resources, build institutions which continuously talk, build enough resources for us to meet each other. The right wing has definitely out-organized us. They have also out-resourced us. They have so much more resources, so much more resources. I mean, in Pakistan, there's a hell lot of a difference in terms of the resources the right wing has, this backing they get from, let's say, the state itself, and where the left is at, and where the feminist movement's at. And there's so much just sort of this calling out of each other that very little remains for us to come together. And I think in order for international politics, we really have to identify our enemies, and we also have to identify the common good, which we've been unable to do so. I think for me, it's important to call out the empire in all of this, and also going beyond just calling out the empire and really taking action, disruptive action. And I think for that, it's not possible to do it just on your own, from your own country, from your own location. So yeah, I mean, these are the things I can, and also talking about debt cancellation, climate reparations, that I don't see that happening. I mean, given the kind of crisis we are in, I also feel like, when we talk about this and we don't see the possibility of that future where this is possible. And I think it's very important to also question that crisis of imagination that we have, that we've been so tied to the system, we've been so entrapped that it's almost impossible to imagine that an alternative is possible to the kind of global politics that is there right now. We are unable to imagine a pro-people internationalist sort of politics. And I think narrative building work, what Shanelle is doing, really is at the center of this. I'll stop here, but yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tooba. Really, thank you for pointing out the interconnectedness of all our different struggles, and how important it is for us to really combine all those different struggles across national borders. Our enemies are working across international borders. They don't care about the difference, the different locations. It's a unitary system, and it needs a unitary response. So thank you so much for highlighting that, and in particular for showing how Palestine, the struggle in Palestine, is really a key point in this. Because if it's happening to Palestine, it can happen to anyone, and all of us need to make sure that never again means never again. Like, really. Nimmi, you're currently working with you're in South Africa right now with different movement actors that are pushing back against this system, right? But we know that social movements face ever more surveillance and repression in many parts of the globe. How should we respond? Like, what does it mean to be radical in this context? And how can social movements navigate this moment of political repression against the necessity of systemic change?
I think a lot of what's being talked about here and the question you're asking me is not about when you say internationalism, it's the point at which you connect to the struggle, right? You cannot just say Sri Lanka and Pakistan have to work together, right? Sri Lanka in particular, since that is where I'm from and do the work, it's about, again, what becomes visible to us with power and with women's roles. So when I went to a women's conference in Thailand recently, there was a poster that said, you know, Sri Lankan women against corruption, against the debt crisis, and Myanmar women, and that this is what freedom was and this is what feminism was, right? And that's what they were teaching young activists. Yes, in Sri Lanka, there was a debt crisis. Yes, the women in the capital organized. But the debt crisis came from an investment in a military that just committed a genocide in 2009. Right? That is what happened. So that is not, you cannot be a feminist in the capital fighting economic corruption and also supporting genocide in the villages. That is not my feminism. I don't think it should be anybody's feminism. When that happened, the revolution in Sri Lanka, or whatever it was called, a revolution, the activists in Colombo all of a sudden reached out to the Tamils in the north, the Tamil women, and said, we're going to give you space. Why don't you come join us? And the Tamils in the north said, we don't need your space. The women told me directly, they said, either the state gives you space or we take space. But unless you're willing to have the conversation about why the debt crisis originated in the genocide of the Tamil people, then this is not a space we want to be a part of. Right? So the point of connection is very important here. How do we connect to each other? And this, I think, is where it comes back to narrative in a different way. And my work on narrative comes from hearing this word. You know, I tell younger folks a lot when they say, how do you locate political voice? I say, you start with discomfort. You know, someone says something at the UN, a group of men say something, someone says something in class, and like something inside of you is like, I don't agree with that. You know, maybe you're angry, maybe you're frustrated, but you can't figure out quite what it is, but something makes you uncomfortable. Then you start to mark that over time. That's how consciousness builds. You don't react to it immediately on social media. Again, visible versus invisible work for political engagement. And this word narrative kept coming back to me in all these different forms, from foundations, from, you know, we're doing narrative change, narrative work, narrative. And not, you know, obviously folks like Shanelle who have a deeper understanding. This was largely white people. But what it kept coming back to me that like, we're not saying the same thing. We're using the same word, but we're not saying the same thing, right? What you're talking about is a kind of cerebral curiosity that determines, you know, the opinion in the New York Times op-ed. My people are talking about narrative as it emerges from embodied deprivation. Those are two very different things, right? And so this piece that I wrote is called The Garret. It's actually based in, I don't know if you can see it, but it's based in like, the garret comes from incidents in the life of a slave girl. It was a very famous text in the United States, Harriet Jacobs. But she writes her story from inside an attic, which is called a garret, about her captivity. And it's been called the first Black feminist counter-narrative because not only did she write her own story, but she made visible the conditions of her captivity. So this became a way of me thinking about how you have to first make visible the lines of narrative captivity before you can say it has an emancipatory potential, right? So when she talks about the body on this line, she says it's 9 feet, the body can survive here. She can move right to left, but that's it, the body can stay flat. So for me, that became a way of thinking about how do we use narrative for the bodies, particularly of women and gender nonconforming folks, to survive? What are the words we use? Victim, survivor, right? All of that language is for the body to survive. And we have to do that. When I defend an asylum case in court, I'm not going to say she was a land rights activist from El Salvador. I'm going to say she's a victim of domestic violence because my obligation is for her body to survive. No? Then you have this, which was like 3 feet and she's 5 feet tall. And that part of the attic to me was about the narrative ceiling, which will always cut your head off, right? So what do I mean by that? Those of us who try to resist through narrative, a piece that I wrote for the New York Times about the hysterectomies happening at the border and how can we talk about choice in terms of Roe versus Wade and which clinic you can go to when many of our people have lost the ability to have children at all because of the state sterilizing them. And they were very happy to publish it because it was like a deeper take on this, except when they came back to me and said, and so, I said, I don't know, and so, white supremacy, I don't know. And they said, and so, and I went back to the women who actually had their uteruses removed by the state, and they said they wanted the abolition of ICE, of the border control. Not reparations, not to get back in the country after they were deported, but they wanted the abolition of a carceral system. Once I put the word abolition in, the New York Times cut the piece. That is the narrative ceiling. You cannot cross that in the public discourse. This, the roof, became a way of me thinking about the words that she says, when I lay on my back, I can almost see freedom through the slats of this, became the words that kind of layer on top of each other to protect the state. Capacity building, empowerment, all of these words that I've taken down in different papers that make you believe that you're going to be free, but are, again, protecting the state. And then on top of this, you know, she was living on top of her grandmother's house, and there's this idea of like storytelling, and that again, the elders and storytelling, that's also become bastardized in service of the state. When people come to me and say they want the stories of the young people I work with, I say no. No, because I know what you want. You want to pull their raw pain into your political agenda. My folks will hold their pain inside of a political project. You cannot have them for your storytelling because that's your story, you know? And so I think, you know, I'll just sort of, you know, anchor it in where we are right now. Like the garret is anchored in the theory of Black feminists, but it's filled with the stories of women from across the global South. Because in these ways, we find connection to each other. We are still, all of us, under this kind of narrative captivity, and we can move from that place recognizing, but that is a deeper place to move from. What's happening here in the conference that I'm organizing is difficult, and it's not visible. We had a conversation on the Black liberation struggle yesterday. It's the first time many Tamils have heard anything about the Black liberation struggle, right? And so those are not easy conversations because even the Tamil Palestinian conversation, there's a beautiful conversation happening. But of course, there's some of the Tamils who feel, well, where were you guys in 2009? And that's okay. That's a normal response, right? So the work that is actually to connect from a deeper political place, first cannot be visible. But also, I think that it's a mistake to be distracted by the other forms of engagement that appear to be internationalism or movement building or transnational movement building that are in fact reinforcing a kind of structure of power and violence.
Thank you so much, Nimmi. Yeah, lots to think about there in terms of like what space, room we have. I'm struck by how the physical representation of the garret, where you actually really feel physically constrained in being unable to stand and speak a truth. And I think that feeling should resonate with a lot of people that are currently in this moment, looking at the world, seeing the world for what it is, and then finding ourselves limited in being able to articulate what we're seeing or facing very dire consequences when we actually do. So I'm curious how this all links with the. I'd like to see how it proceeds with the session that you're doing in South Africa, and I'd like to really see how these movements find a way to tell the story together in a way. Thank you so much for that, Shanelle. I think it will be a great follow-up here to what Nimmi has just spoken about. To find out from you, drawing from your new book, can you say how global social movements can build narrative power in these fractured times? Is it possible to build a new anti-oppression, social justice, common sense in an age where we're seeing really divisive internet echo chambers?
Yeah, Yeah, and I love so much what Tooba and Nimmi just offered, and I'm feeling very inspired by their thinking. I think it's important to remember for us that it's not only possible, it's necessary. And we've also done it before. And what you're referencing, Sean, and for folks who are interested, is there's an anthology that I edited that'll be out next week called Liberation Stories, Building Narrative Power for 21st Century Social Movements. And it looks at the first 25 years of the social movement left's interventions in the United States primarily, but also has a chapter from Nigeria, from Palestine, and from Brazil. And we're looking to do a global anthology as well with a group of global narrative workers. But I'm focused on the US primarily, so I'll just mention some things. I was talking before during my last answer about how we are in a regressive reactionary period, and reactionary politics are characterized by a desire for nostalgia, by authoritarianism rhetoric, by returning to a past that really never was. And we are in that era, and the way that politics is patterned is that we go into progressive eras and then regressive eras, and we are in that kind of regressive reactionary era. And I think that's important for movement workers to remember, from the activists to the advocates to the organizers, because these patterns are cyclical. And if we can remember that, we can be prepared for that cycle. And I think that, in our progressive era of the 2010s, we saw, in what is covered in this book, we exposed the war on terror as a racist machine of surveillance and control. We linked it to the occupation of Palestine, building solidarity from Gaza to Guantanamo. We insisted that the violence here in the US isn't coming from our communities, rather it's coming from the state. We also made the case that environmental justice is racial justice, that reparations is not charity, that indigenous sovereignty is law. We also reimagined survivor justice beyond carceral logic through the Me Too movement. We fought anti-trans legislation with unapologetic truth-telling about the lives and dignity of trans people. We also moved the healthcare debate from who deserves healthcare to healthcare is a right. We also pushed socialism into the public discourse through the Occupy movement and brought Fight for 15 frame into the conversation. Certainly not enough. We also redefined what democracy could look like through policy and organizing, and occupied the streets. And so this is not failure. This was a progressive era in which the Black Lives Matter movement, the immigrant rights movement, were shaping how we understood society and helping people make meaning of their experiences. And so I want to say something important, because I'm just really struck by Nimmi's offering around the garret and the ceiling, which is that narrative power alone will not save us. But we cannot win without it, because we are in an ideological contest for the future. And so this anthology, which is just one text in the amazing corpus of texts on narrative and movement building and strategy and organizing, emerges from the understanding that narrative is not ornamental to movements. It is a precondition for it. When you are an organizer and you go to a door, you are not miming to people, you are communicating to them, you are persuading them. And I often will offer that the primary distinction between propaganda and persuasion is consent, because we want those people to say yes. Yes, we want to be a part of your movement. Yes, we want to join you in fighting our oppressors. And so, we've seen from Standing Rock to Palestinian liberation that people are crafting new stories that do challenge the dominant hegemonic narratives of our society and assert a counter narrative that is strong and persuasive and visual and compelling, with story, but also history, and is rooted in those traditions I was talking about, and is guided by a certain set of principles about how we communicate about people and places. And so, we have an opportunity right now as the social movement left to define a compelling and materially grounded story, one that moves beyond resistance, but actually sets the terms of what comes next and distinguishes us in the US in particular from the Democratic Party, who lacks vision and lacks spine and is just weak. And we need we need to center movement building organizations as a part of the infrastructure that is going to get people free in this country. But in this crisis that we're in this reactionary politic where they're trying to pull us back with book bans and violence from the police, we have to ask ourselves, what is the story that the social movement left wants to tell? Where are we going? How do we situate ourselves within this historical moment with clarity and with purpose? And how do we mobilize a broad base of people toward our vision? Because fascism offers a clear and emotionally compelling narrative, a return to law and order, a scapegoat for every crisis, a vision of power and domination. And so we struggle sometimes to articulate that bold, unified alternative. And that's fair for us because we are trying to widen the bigger we. We are not trying to narrow it and make everybody fit into one specific category. And so building narrative power in these fractured times really requires three things. And I'll say these in closing. We don't have to choose between pragmatism and radicalism, between incremental wins and transformative demands. We can reject this binary. We have to not water down our vision, but to make it irresistible for people. We can do that by focusing on historical memory, right? As we argue in the book, our movements are not new. We are part of a long arc of resistance, from maroon communities to labor strikes to Black feminist theory, as Nimmi was talking about. By anchoring our narratives in time, we remind people that we faced collapse before, and we've built beauty in the aftermath of that collapse. The second thing is we need narrative agility. We need, we all know and have seen firsthand how the internet rewards speed and spectacle. And we have to be mindful that movements must be nimble and grounded and ready with language that speaks to people. And I often think about the words of Ida B. Wells. She says, "I never use a word of two syllables where one will do." And this reminds us to be grounded in where our communities are coming from and how they have to understand in a salient way the ideas that we are trying to share with them. But also that those ideas come from those communities. And so when I was talking about opportunities, this narrative agility means being ready for the opportunities that will certainly arise. And finally, I will just say that, we don't do anything by ourselves. That narrative power building, just like organizing, is about collective authorship. Where narrative's not just what we are saying, right? As Nimmi pointed out, it's about who gets to speak. It's about the embodied experience of oppressed people. So that means democratizing storytelling, funding creators of color, building horizontal media collectives, and fighting for the material conditions that allow people to dream and create. Because without those conditions, people will not have the space or the infrastructure to be able to tell their stories. And I will end there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shanelle. Thank you so much for this. It's essentially, it feels to me like the beginnings of what must be a manifesto for how we claim back the narrative power, like how we build again and really control the narrative and gain that discursive power back from the oligarchs and right now from the far right. I'd just like to point out right now that, all of this work that we're doing as the Transnational Institute, as our organizing partners, NOR, Alternative Information Development Center, the Global Network of Movement Lawyers, the Asia Europe People's Forum, it takes work, it takes time, it takes resources. So if you feel compelled, if you're enjoying this content, if you think it helps, please do consider a donation or support for any of these organizations. And I mention this now because Shanelle just mentioned we need to support also producers of color. We need to support also all the different storytellers that are trying to bring a different story from what we're seeing from those that are in power at the moment. So thank you so much for this inspiring input. And we'd now like to move over to a question and answer segment. So we've collected some of the questions from the Q&A and have been tracking the conversation in the chat. I think for now, the first Q&A question, I think I would like to direct to you, Tooba. This is a question from Fazana Bari in the chat. I've tried to kind of narrow it down a little bit. Thank you, Nick, for somewhat summarizing it. Fazana says, I find the dichotomy between activism and organizing unhelpful. There are multiple ways of organizing, and activists play diverse roles in advancing rights and social justice. Dismissing certain forms of activism is akin to negating the contributions of writers, teachers, musicians, artists, and filmmakers, as well as minimizes the risks activists face in challenging such norms, should be acknowledged and respected. I think she's asking you, Tooba, here to elaborate a bit more about how you see the difference and the continuity between the two.
Hi. So yeah, I mean, my intention here was not to dismiss any particular form of activism, but rather to ask or invite us to really reflect on the kind of work we're doing and the lasting impact of it. I think my own experience tells me, that activism has become kind of like one of the only ways most people want to engage in. I've also seen how there's, I mean, as an activist, I mean, left, for example, the left in Pakistan is very, very small. So I was cracking this joke with one of my comrades that there are more people critiquing the left in Pakistan than actually people doing the work of the left in Pakistan. So for me, it's why is it so important that people have this long-term commitment to a cause is because it's not possible without it. I mean, you're not accountable. I mean, the lack of accountability for me is a very, very big problem in the movement building space in my country, at least, because it's so much of it, is then becomes all about self-expression rather than a collective politics, and ideologically driven politics. And I think that's where my critique is at, that if you're not accountable to anyone but yourself, I don't know how helpful that is for the movements. It might be helpful in the moment. It might be helpful for that certain protest. But I don't know without accountability, how do we build something long term? And I think that's my main gripe with activism, that many of the activists, and I have been an activist, I've worked where I've not been associated with organizations for a better part of my life, really. And I do see how damaging some of the things that I myself did were to the movement. So I do feel that that kind of accountability is very important, because in the absence of those structures and institutions, what ends up happening is these conversations about the nuances, about the issues, about the sort of the harms we do to each other in the movements are not happening within the movement, that they happen on social media. And we all know, I mean, it sounds like a very small issue when we talk about it in a panel, but within our movements, we do know that what kind of damage it causes when there's no space for that accountability within the movement. And then it happens in sort of like in the open. It happens where the people don't even understand what is happening. And we've lost so many potential movement workers. We've lost so many potential organizers, because there was no accountability within the movement. So we see all these fights, we see the arguments, the issues coming out in the public without really ever being able to resolve them. So I do feel, in order to build institution and organization which have a lifespan bigger than our own individual lifespans, we need to do that kind of work. We need to commit to a long-term ideology. We need to commit to a long-term organizing, party politics, or movement building, but also with a very sort of clear accountability processes, regulatory kind of frameworks within the movement. I think these are very important. I don't know how, I mean, the enemies we're up against, especially when we talk about state violence, it requires us to organize in such a manner, to have these disciplined organizations where these conversations can happen, where transparency can exist within the organization. And I don't know how, in the absence of long-term organizing, that kind of work can happen. And absolutely, I do agree with Fazana, the contributions of writers. I mean, I write myself, I've taught myself, I've done a lot of creative artwork for the movements, and I do think it's all part of organizing. It's not everybody has to I mean, a creative doesn't have to come to all the meetings, definitely. They can just work from, their own space. They can create art from there. But the people who are actually building these movements in the long term, some of us have to commit long term. I don't think this on and off sort of involvement with the movements is really helpful. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Tooba. So really consistency and making long-term goals and working daily in the communities and building power, I think you're saying will give us a better chance at success than periodic and episodic engagements with the issues. I mean, you put it way more eloquently than that, but this is kind of what I'm getting. The difference really indeed between organizing and mobilizing, as Yara says in the chat. Nimmi, maybe I'd like to address this next question to you that we got in the chat. It's from an anonymous contributor who says, thank you for this great session. What are the ethical and practical implications of organizing activist movements around democratic centralism versus flat or horizontal hierarchies? In terms of long-term sustainability, accountability, and power dynamics, what possibilities or limitations do each offer for building resilient, transformative movements in your experience? This is just from the audience. I don't know if you find that a compelling enough question.
Can you say the two distinctions that that they're making again? Democratic?
I think it's more about democratic centralized organizations versus those that try to have a flat hierarchy, so to speak, which I always found as a oxymoronic
I understand.
flat
Yeah.
hierarchy.
Okay, you're talking about the structure of movements themselves.
Yeah.
It's a complicated thing, no? Because at some point, when you're the besieged group and the other side has more power, at some point there has to be a kind of homogeneity between you, like inside the Tamils, in order for you to come up against the more powerful entity, let's say the Sri Lankan government. And so there is a kind of flattening that happens, of dissent in that moment. But it's also about, I think, thinking about the timeline of struggle, right? Like, how do we look at a longer timeline of struggle? There is often a critique of the Tigers, let's say, as fascists, as quelling dissent, right? And there was a moment where there was a violent, kind of interaction with multiple movements, but there was also a moment inside the struggle where there began to be very important conversations, because the reality is in some struggles versus others, like more often in those that hold territory, you need to have the popular support of the people, right? If you control territory. So you have to be in conversation with the people. So you don't really have the ability to be entirely fascist, right? Like that's not possible for them. And so some of the work that I did in my earlier work was in pointing out, again, like where do we read resistance from? Like, did we see a bunch of young women in the streets protesting the Tigers? No. But we did see young women that I knew, or Tamil women who, let's say one of them was raped by a soldier in the village, right? And speaking to her, her husband said to report it, the family said to report it. So these notions of shame and all that stuff, were not there. She made a decision to not say anything because she felt the village was doing very well in terms of the water and what was happening in the farms and the fields and whatever, because this soldier was there. The way we frame it from the West, we may not see that as resistance, but it is political action. It is a choice that she made, right? There was a long conversation inside the movement about forced recruitment, right? And the church got involved in that conversation. And that became something that eventually the church was able to sort of create a shift inside the movement from that perspective, right? Even the women who joined initially, as one of the Palestinians said here yesterday, like, you have to fight, and so that there's always going to be a more complicated conversation happening, right? A lot of people look at the Tamils from the outside and they'll say, well, there's no critique in the movement. That's also a question of timeline, right? Is this the moment that we're asking everybody to condemn Hamas? Or is this the moment that that's an internal conversation for the Palestinians? Of course, there are people who critique the nationalist project in the Tamil struggle. Of course, we critique gender, we critique hierarchies, but will we take those critiques public in order to be weaponized by the other side? That's a different question, right? So political strategy in that sense as well. So I think, it doesn't matter which movement you're talking about. There are conversations that you're not privy to, that you don't understand that are happening. There is never an entire flattening of a social movement, right? Even if what you see on the outside is that there is a hierarchy or but particularly when you're talking about armed struggle, at some point there does have to be a homogeneity, right? And at other points you can open it up for conversation. And that's kind of, for the Tamil struggle where we are right now, and what I'm hearing, the Palestinian struggle, where they are too. They're in a moment of sort of reflecting internally about how to move forward, but nobody's going to make those conversations public.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nimmi. Yeah, indeed, always many different elements come into play with this kind of decisions, I guess. And as much as all our movements have to come together, each movement deals with its particular material, social, economic, political conditions and has to make decisions accordingly. Shanelle, a question for you. I think this came from Mark Langdon in the chat. So it says so much of these issues being raised connect for me to concepts of Freire, I guess Paulo Freire, Hooks, and Audre Lorde. How can we develop more opportunities for popular education, developing critical consciousness in collective spaces? I think essentially, how do we move from communications to really building consciousness and real political education, especially in this moment where we're in?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Before I answer, I want to speak to the question that Tooba got about activism and organizing and whether or not that's a helpful distinction.
Yes,
I was the director of communications for the Black Lives Matter Global Network and the Movement for Black Lives for many years. And in the summer of 2020, we saw 26 million people mobilized in the US. And I want to give an example of why it's important for people to understand these distinctions, but not to overly focus on them. I think what the asker was kind of getting at is like, we're also trying to build power together. So let's not get in the weeds about these distinctions because it's not a good use of our time. And I would argue that there certainly is a point at which we don't need to focus so much on those conversations. But in the summer of 2020, the job of the organizer was to take the mobilized and the advocate and the activist and to move them into organizations to build power for the long term. Now, because the philanthropic institutions here in the United States shy away from funding base building, there are fewer organizers to make sure that those moments of rupture and uprising turn into long-term organizing strategy. So certainly if you're a union member, just showing up to a meeting is insufficient. You have to continue coming back to put pressure on the bosses to change the material conditions of the workers. So the job of the organizer, although not more important in any way than the job of the activist or the advocate, is to build long-term power building for the working class people. So I think that's really important. And we didn't have enough organizers in 2020, and that is a reckoning that we're contending with. We could not mobilize those people into institutions. And in many ways, that fractured base building, that missed opportunity, that lack of resourcing from philanthropy has led us into a moment now where we're scrambling to get enough people to push back on authoritarian forces across the United States. So it is an important distinction, although I would agree that people hyper focus on it and kind of become navel gazing, and we have to have a more low ego and high impact approach to that. So to answer the question, and I kind of want to cheat because I did see another question in the chat that just like really spoke to me about the difference between the narrative around identity-based organizing and class-based organizing. But I think that the question around popular education is that there is plenty of popular education out there. I mean, even what we're doing now is a part of that tradition. Every single day. I mean, this is the great thing about the internet. Certainly it allowed for, propaganda to be proliferated more quickly, but it also gave us the opportunity to share information and insights transnationally across movements, issues, and identities. I mean, every day I'm invited to some kind of popular education seminar that's either reacting to a particular moment or giving some context about historical patterns. And so I think that if, and again, this goes to the issue, the job of the organizer and the institution is to make sure that those popular education tools are available to people and their community, and that they are culturally relevant, culturally appropriate, and that they are rooted in a radical vision of society rather than a reformist vision of society. And so I think, to me, that is probably one of the issues with popular education, is like understanding that it has to be culturally relevant to speak to the people that you want to build power with. It has to be, we also have to make sure that as we give people popular education, we're also helping to make sure the material needs are met. It's very hard for a person who is trying to feed their family, taking care of aging parents, not earning enough, struggling with mental health, to also want to be in a position to receive the popular education. So this is why our institutions in civic society have to be really strong to make sure that people's material needs are met so they can participate in organized resistance. But just one quick thing, if I can just take a minute or two on this question of this tension of working across movements to navigate either, identity-based movements that lift up experience, culture, and narrative, and class-based movements that root power in material conditions and labor. The implications of this disconnect are really significant in U.S. organizing. So when movements centered on race and gender and sexuality and disability sideline critiques of capitalism, certainly we risk winning representation within systems still built on extraction and disposability. And on the other hand, when class struggle frameworks flatten people's identities to worker or to laborer, they erase the very real ways capitalism sorts people differently based on race, gender, ability, and more characteristics. And so both perspectives are incomplete on their own. Class is never experienced in a vacuum. It's always racialized, it's always gendered, it's always shaped by historical and colonial context. And identity cannot be separated from material conditions, right? How we live, what we're paid, how we're housed, or how we survive. And so movements that treat narrative and structure as opposites are going to always miss the opportunity to build real lasting power. So we have to understand our work ahead not as about collapsing difference or forcing alignment, but about integrating, bringing narrative and structure into conversation. So that means we need to develop strategies that are as attentive to care and culture as they are to wages and wealth, for example. We have to build a politics that names capitalism, builds collective economic power among working class people, and also refuses to reduce people to any one dimension of their identity. And so that's the promise, really, of intersectional narrative organizing that's grounded in a class analysis, that not identity versus class, but identity within class. And that's how we build a majority that can actually win.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shanelle. I really do think we should put, now I'm looking forward to reading the book because I'm sure that's where all of this is coming from. And indeed, those are some of the elements that we need to really build a counterpower that changes the world that we're in. We've got a few minutes left in today's session, and I thought to just hand it over to you now, Nimmi first, and Shanelle. Apologies on behalf of Tooba, who had to leave, but I'd like to really just give you a moment, Nimmi, right now to reflect on today's conversation. I think also to embed it in currently where you are, the conversations that you're in, and what insights you would like us to take from today. How really do we resist and win?
I think what I'm reflecting on this week is how we find points of connection with each other. And I think that takes a lot of work, and it's not, we had, again, as I said, we had 4 like very thoughtful activists from the Black liberation struggle yesterday speak to us. But if I had asked them to say, like, tell us the history of the ANC or the MK, and the Tamils absorbed that, it would have been very difficult for particularly Ogham Tamils who have never left the island to access that conversation, right? I don't know that we could have built from there. What I did ask them was to talk about their first moments of political consciousness, right? Like what happened that made them politicized, a moment in their childhood, or something they read. And when they did that, I could see the Tamils starting to nod, like, yes, we were confused when there was Tamil on Tamil violence. Like one of the activists, anti-apartheid activists said, like, we didn't understand what was happening when there was black on black violence happening, or that being like a queer body, like being forced to be like a Jehovah's Witness to like take the queer out of you, like at a young age. And I could see our trans folks sort of nodding, like, yeah, that was a moment that was like, oh shit, maybe I have to fight to be me, right? Connecting from that point, I saw something building there. I don't know how you would describe it. I don't know. But I think this is a lot of what my work is, and what I hope we continue to do is to make visible various forms of captivity in order for us to connect from a deeper place, right? And not a lived experience kind of way, but in these sort of complex emotional reactions to oppression. How do we connect from that place of I felt like that as well, like a kind of loneliness. And as I told everybody at the beginning of the week, I have, of course, these ambitious plans for all the struggles to be connected. But if in the end what we did is to make people feel less lonely, it's not easy to do this work. It's not easy to stay in the struggle. So if that's what we did, then that's enough for now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nimmi. And over to you, Shanelle. How do we resist and win?
Well, I would like to read just a brief excerpt from the foreword of the book that gives some insight from narrative organizers in the US who are deeply embedded in radical movements, Malkia Devic-Cyril and Jen Soriano. And the question is, what does it mean to be a radical communicator? And Jen and Malkia argue that we are the orators, the griots, the futurists who breathe life into new ways of being and leading and loving. We recognize that polarization as a consequence of widening social and economic inequalities are only made worse by intensifying climate change. We understand that these inequalities can only be addressed by building power to shift conditions towards equality and transformative democracy. We refuse to surrender to policies and practices that shift conditions towards authoritarianism. We grow our ranks, expose dominant power, and engage people through vision and hope. We build the infrastructure necessary to move narratives from marginal to mass line, which means contending with corporate and elite power in a digital age. We are the meaning makers who promote agency, protagonism, and connection in a time of manufactured isolation and fear. And what I take from that is to remember that we are in an ideological contest for the future, that we can win that contest. We have to be intentional about the kinds of coalitions and organizations that we're building to help capture people who are ready to be organized, that we have to narrate this era, because the future isn't just something that's happening to us, it's something that we are narrating into existence. And also have to remember that the empire is going to always try to write the ending of the story, and it is our job to ensure that they do not get the last word.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shanelle. And thank you so much to all our panelists that have participated in today's session. Thank you so much to also all the organizations behind this series, the Fractures Internationalist Teaching Series. This was session 7, our penultimate session. We have our next session next week. This one's recorded and will be made available to you together with a digest of the session. If you have, please give us feedback for this session. There's a link in the chat. I really, really, really would like to ask you to take a moment to give us the feedback, because that's the only way we can improve and make things better. Next week, we've got an amazing panel. I saw somebody already stated in the chat that we need a vision. We need something to rally towards, to come together. So our last session will be about going beyond resistance to also imagining and building liberatory futures. We'll be joined by Kali Akuno, Blesso Gatoni, and Lynn Osome, who you can see on the screen. It's going to be our final session. I highly encourage you to share the session, to share the links, to invite as many people as you can. Let us build a new future together. Let us bring together the different strands of our movements, and let us make sure that we remember the reasons why we do the work. Let's remember the people of Palestine. Let's remember the people of South Sudan. Let's remember the people of Sudan. Let's remember the people in the Congo. Let us remember why we do the work we do, and let us build a liberatory future together. Thank you very much to everybody, and see you next time.